and unmute at the mic. So back to the beginning. Hi. Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Talking Timepieces, where we talk about watch collecting and horology. Sorry about the hiccup. Luckily, it was only 2 minutes into the show before I recognized that all of my cool audience members are saying, "Hey, dude, your mic is muted," which is like a bad Zoom meeting, I guess. But yes, today's topic comes from a question that came in the comments on one of the photographs that I usually post. And sometimes I'll post, "Hey, what do you think we should talk about this week?" And sometimes I get one or two answers, and sometimes I get several. And so I go back and I check those before I decide what to talk about on any given day. And today, I thought we would talk about vintage because some of the questions were about vintage and repair costs and things of that nature. And I thought, well, let's have an episode where we talk about the issues, considerations, problems, and perks of having a vintage piece. Wristwatch check. I'm wearing my Nomos Neomatic 42, a really, really nice piece. I call it my mullet piece. I call it my mullet piece because it's very business in the front and it's party in the back because it's got that beautiful Deutsche Uhrenwerk in-house movement. And Deutsche Uhrenwerk, of course, its legacy dates to before the Second World War. And the Nomos, it's a really nice piece to wear when you want to wear something that's nice and legible and very high quality, but doesn't want to advertise itself too much. Where you are, you might be at a open air concert or something, and that way, when it starts getting dim, you can easily see. And if some person looks at your wrist, they don't think, "Well, let's follow the guy with the sub out of the building." Well, I mean, let's not get too paranoid. But if you're with a group of people, you shouldn't have to worry. But hey, you never know. But the Nomos is a nice enough piece to wear on its own. Um, but I look at it a lot as like my dress beater. I'll wear it places where I'm not quite sure what the environment's going to be like, but I want to wear something nice and also rugged and highly legible. So I go with the Nomos, which is a really nice. I do like this piece. So let's scroll back up and see if what other questions are in here somewhere. But hey, Chris, how's it going? Jean, Warren, Eric. Hey, Eric, how's it going? Oscar. All right, nice to see everybody. So, yeah, because vintage pieces, can also mean more than just watch. This is a pedometer that I picked up from the 1920s, I believe, or so. It's a pedometer. See, and you see how the hand moved, and if I push it, it resets. Um, heck, you don't need a smartwatch. You carry this, and you have your watch for time, and this will tell you how far you. This captures your steps, and it's pocket watches are also. Oh, but that's one of the dangers of pocket watches. This one I have to take in fact, because the front bezel is loose. Um, but this is a beautiful repeater, quarter repeater that I have, and it's a working man's repeater. You could tell because it's doesn't have a gold case, and the repeater button is polished smooth. But it is a very nice piece, and a vintage. One of the perks of a vintage, it allows you to have complications that are unaffordable in modern pieces. You know. Um, and some have history. Like, for example, some of you have probably seen me or heard me talk about this jitterbug, this jitterbug World War II 10-second stopwatch. Um, it's really a beautiful vintage piece and a piece of history, which is one of the nice things about vintage pieces. And even to the risque. Let me put my finger over strategic places. I have an erotic pocket watch from the 1920s. You know, they didn't have any internet back then. Haha. Um, and so vintage is really a nice way to explore the watch world and historical pieces and interesting complications and interesting movements. Like, for example, I have this vintage Bulova Ambassador with the linen dial. Beautiful piece. It has an internal Cyclops magnifier, so it's smooth to the front, but it does have a magnifier over the date. And it has a Burin micro rotor movement in it, which is a relative of the Burin chronometer module that was in the Monaco chronograph. And it's also just a nice dress watch. This works really well with a suit and slides beautifully under a cuff. And it's just large enough to be contemporary, but, you know, works with a suit. And if you have smaller wrists, works as a daily wear too. But I do like this piece. I think I'm going to give this one to my son-in-law. He's a nice guy, and he needs a suit watch. He's got a Sea Dweller, but he has no dress watches. And I gave him a Bulova Navigator, a really nice Bulova Navigator, and he likes that piece. So I think I'll give him this Bulova Ambassador and flesh out his Bulova collection. I do have a Bulova. It's up there. I have the Lunar Pilot, the meteorite dial, but that's not vintage, so I didn't happen to have it handy to talk about, with our vintage pieces overview. But interesting complications and interesting movements are the hallmark of a vintage piece. Here's a Bulova Accutron Space View, right? Tuning fork. I don't think you can hear it through the mic, but let's give it a shot. But this is a beautiful piece. You can wear it today. And it's very accurate. It's more accurate than a mechanical. It's 360 beats a second. Um, it's a tuning fork. And the tuning fork is actually physically connected to the movement. It's not, I mean, there's not a physical join, but there's a micro spring with a ruby on the end that pushes a gear, the gear that runs the drivetrain for the clock. So the tuning fork physically moves the movement. The electronics are just there. The electronics are just there to get the tuning fork moving. But once the tuning fork, well, I mean, while the tuning fork, because it's constantly powered, but while the tuning fork is vibrating, its vibrations directly push the gear train on the watch. And that's one of the reasons why that hand sweeps so smoothly. The only thing that sweeps that smoothly nowadays would be a spring drive, which it sweeps smoother. It's 30 some odd, it goes to a straight quartz frequency. Although I don't know how well, it's a magnetic clutch, so yes, it's almost near analog levels of granularity. Let's put it that way. Gian, vintage, not really vintage, but decades old watch. Well, if it's decades plural, then it's vintage because, well, it depends antique versus vintage and the like. But I would say once it's an antique, it's vintage, and antiques 25 to 30 years, and it's an antique. But what I'd like to get is a Seiko back when Seiko were really, really great, not overpriced, and they just do the job of telling the time, like an old Pogue, the old Pogue chronographs, which was the model that tied with the Zenith El Primero Chronomaster as the first integrated um, automatic chronograph. As I was talking about the Burin micro rotor chronometer. It was a module that was put together with a chronograph module to make the Monaco. So the Monaco was an automatic chronograph, but it was a modular automatic chronograph. And the Zenith El Primero is an integrated automatic chronograph high beat, and so is the Seiko Pogue. And the reason they call it the Pogue is a Colonel Pogue went up, I believe, in the space shuttle wearing one. And prior to that, NASA was not really thrilled about the idea of a an automatic because they thought it might not work well in microgravity. Although intuitively, a swing weight would still work on inertia, and there is lots of inertia in microgravity, the same amount of inertia as here. If I move my arm back and forth in microgravity or in regular gravity, the swing weight that winds the watch will still go back and forth. Um, if I'm completely still, it won't automatically, point downwards, but if I'm not moving, it's gonna stay stationary no matter what direction it's pointed in. But yeah, so, when Colonel Pogue wore a Seiko into space and automatic, um, it paved the way for other people to wear their own. A lot of other people wore other watches. Some Rolexes went up as passengers under the spacesuits of some of the Apollo astronauts, and, Zinn famously had a piece that went up with one of the, German astronauts on this. That was a space shuttle mission, I remembered, specifically. I think the Pogue was the space station, but, the Zinn 152, I believe, is the model number. It's a beautiful, beautiful black-faced chrono, and, they have a modern version of it, the ZX1, I believe it's called, and that also has, center minutes on the chrono, like the old, Omegas and, Lamanias. Tap, "Hey, how's it going?" And, "Hey, Robert, how's it going?" "Can't stay today, have to catch the recording." "Well, thanks for coming in and saying hi." Um, "Robert, don't worry, you can always watch the yes, exactly. Video on demand. Everyone's chatting back and forth. Sin 142, yes, there you go. Thank you, Chris, I appreciate that. And that was really nice, and it had a Lamania, based movement in it, the 5100. And, center minutes is a nice touch on a chronograph because you get, it's easier to see the elapsed minutes instead of having to look at a, um, totalizer. I just looked at my three-hander as if there was gonna magically sprout some chrono hands. But speaking of vintage chronos, as I was saying, vintage allows you to have, functionalities that you may not be able to afford in a modern piece, like this, Walkman flyback chronograph. This is a flyback chrono. Um, it's worth about, I don't know, about 1,000 bucks or so, but it's also a vintage piece. Walkman has a legacy within the, watch industry because Walkman was an American who imported parts and the like and built watches and sold them inside the United States. And his company was bought by the company that eventually became Breitling. So you could almost say the Walkman heritage carries through into, and I mean, you can pretty much guess, well, chrono design is pretty universal in some ways, but you can see some Breitling DNA in this old Walkman. Great 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 grandfather, grand uncle, maybe, but having an interesting piece, something that, you can talk about, or even just a piece that you can say, well, for example, I don't like gold, yellow gold, but this is a first generation Junghans radio controlled watch. And so a friend offered it to me, and I'm like, I'll take it. It doesn't work, but it doesn't need to be a representative of the first generation of radio controlled watches. I could probably take it in and have it fixed, and then just have it run in the case. But I don't wear it, so I don't mind it not being a functional model. But it is a first generation radio controlled clock, wristwatch. So vintage gives you all kinds of interesting ways to play with time, as it were. Let's see, Oscar. So my Doxa of 100 years old is vintage or antique? Both, both. Um, your best bets. Google the terms and compare their various definitions. but I would say, vintage implies a certain level of quality and collectibility, like a vintage wine, as opposed to just wine that is old, or a vintage car, as opposed to a car that is just old. So I would say, at least from my position, I feel that vintage has a more of a up market cachet as opposed to antique being a generic. I mean, it doesn't have to be positive or negative to call something antique, but sometimes you can call something antique and not mean it in a nice way. Whereas vintage, it's hard to use the word vintage as an insult. So I guess that would be probably my good rule of thumb, at least the way I look at it is, yeah, vintage implies a certain level of quality and collectability. So like that Doxa is vintage because it's a vintage piece from a company with a nice legacy, and the company is still in demand today. So yeah, it's totally vintage, and it's also an antique. So, like I said, thinking about that whole aspect of vintage, those are a lot of positives, and some of the others are they are less expensive. You know, Depends on the vintage piece. Some vintage pieces are so collectible that they are significantly more expensive than a comparable contemporary piece. And it doesn't just have to be a vintage Rolex, it could be a vintage Patek or but vintage very high-end watch, or even some interesting pieces that that just have a certain cachet to them will sell over their original retail, or at least retain some serious value, like the Porsche design chrono that Tom Cruise wore in Top Gun. Some watches pick up a certain cachet through history, like the Monaco. The Tag Heuer Monaco picked up a cachet because Steve McQueen used it in Le Mans, the movie Le Mans, and Paul Newman and the Rolex, Daytona, So vintage definitely throws a connotation of, collectibility on it that the term antique may or may not necessarily confer. Oh, Chris, had issues getting spare parts for your Speedy. I know I was with you, my heart goes out to you, my friend, because yeah, Chris is trying to get his Mark II Speedy fixed. Uh, Getting spare parts from the '70s, yeah. After 12 months, I gave up and sent it to Omega. Now they charge me double, but I'll be getting it back within 4 to 6 weeks, and you'll be getting it back in, factory, refurbished condition. They'll replace everything nice with new, well, not new, but, new old stock, uh, warehoused Omega parts, and so you'll be happier with the functional piece, which a watch is worth repairing because a broken watch, unless it's something like this one, a broken watch is not worth much at all. And so that's why you need to maintain your watches. And that brings up, and Chris brings it up at the perfect timing, because I was about to um, segue into some of the negative things about vintage pieces. And one of them is maintenance. It's like you managed to find a Porsche 911 really cheap, and the reason you got it really cheap is the owner sold it to you right before it needed a new transmission, and it needed new brakes, and needed new head gasket, and needed new XYZ exhaust system, catalytic, you name the system, and maybe the car will even run for another 10 years without you touching any of those major systems. But those repairs are on the horizon, and you may not think of them. And that goes the same for a watch. You pick up a nice vintage piece, and at some point, you're going to have that thing taken in and at minimum cleaned and reoiled and reassembled, because modern watches have the oils that are used in modern watches are pretty good, and they have a much, much, much longer shelf life. But old watches, vintage watches, antique watches, those are old vintage antique lubricants in them. A lot of the pieces that are made before the 70s didn't have any kind of synthetics in them at all. Um, Back in the old timey days, they probably used whale oil or something like that, you know. And obviously, if the watch was served at any point in time in the intermediate, there would be other oils as the technology improved. But if you're wearing a watch from the 70s, you're probably gonna need to have it serviced in the next 5 to 10 years. You should have had it serviced by now, but I do know people who won't have a watch serviced until it starts acting up, but then once it starts acting up, you're in for a service. There's gonna almost certainly be parts replacement involved, you know? So regardless of the watch and the age, maintenance has to be a concern that you have to keep in mind. But for a vintage piece, it could get much more complicated. As Chris points out, you might go around and find, and the place that we were at was an OEM. I mean, and not an OEM, original equipment manufacturer. No, they were an AD, and they weren't able to source the parts, so they had to send it in to Omega. And sometimes that doesn't even work. My Speed Sonic, I sent it to Omega. Omega sent it back saying, we don't have the parts. I had to send it to the Accutron doctor in Tokyo to get that watch repaired. But he even replaced the base plate. So, the when it comes to vintage pieces, if you can find a specialist, odds are they'll have all of the parts you need for that product. I mean, like, there are probably Omega shops that specialize in Omega that aren't ADs, but that specialize in Omega repair that you could probably locate and send your watch to them. But if you can send it to Omega at that point, you might as well send it to Omega. And then you get the cool travel box they send it back in. Um, but yeah, parts sourcing beyond the cost of repair, sourcing parts is the biggest issue. If you can't get the parts, you can't fix the watch. In the intermediate future, I think we're probably going to have some really high end watch repair facilities have 3D printers and start 3D printing parts, like at least pallet forks and escapement wheels and things of that nature. And maybe one day even hairsprings, but I doubt that you would get that kind of 3D printing granularity in well, you're competing with MEMS at that point, and you're not gonna find a 3D printer that'll do, uh, that level of, finish. You could probably find a 3D printer that could print something at that size, but it wouldn't be polished, which would be a important thing if it's gonna be used as a hairspring in a watch or in other MEMS applications. So, but I could easily see 3D printed gears and pallet forks and escapement wheels and the like, eventually one day, being made available for the watch folk. But in the interim, be careful with your vintages and don't drop them. And if you have, I've always advised to have a time grapher. If you notice your amplitudes dropping significantly or your beat errors going up, or things of that nature, those are hints that there are issues, and stitch in time saves nine. Preventative maintenance, there's a reason it's called preventative, because if you do that maintenance, you prevent serious issues down the road. So repair costs, um, the the parts themselves, sometimes the expertise, depending on the movement, you need a really well informed and experienced watchmaker to properly service it. Maybe you have something that's special. Maybe you have something that's so special that you have to send it back to the manufacturer to get fixed because no one else can fix it. So those are all things you have to think about. In the case of vintage pieces, usually, as I said, there's one or two specialists in that type of watch somewhere on the planet. And with airmail and international emails and telephone calls, you can talk to somebody on the other side of the planet and send your watch there if you need to be repaired, like I did. You know, um, I have. Another vintage piece I have is, or at least it's, what do they call a car after it's 25 years old? I forget. But yeah, antique, I believe. So but this is an old, oyster quartz, and I had, ironically, this exact model, exact color and all, and I sold it, and I regretted it, and I've rebought bought it, but the one that I had sold, I actually sent it had a broke date wheel, and I sent it to, Rolex, and so they replaced everything, and I didn't mind because the oyster quartz, I didn't have it because I wanted it for its patina or anything like that, and, but they replaced everything, and it cost 1,700 euros at the time. That's a lot of money, but it was worth it because, again, broke watch isn't worth much at all, and this has gone up in value, by more than what I paid to repair it over the years, and this wasn't the one I had repaired anyway. But the money I made selling and rebuying, I didn't lose any in that transaction chain, and this is in very, very good shape, and was serviced at one point by Rolex. I have the papers. So I'm very pleased with this. But again, you have to really be careful and take care of your stuff and make sure that it's maintained properly. If any issues happen with it, that it needs to be repaired. Um, those are all serious considerations. Um, and then the other side, it may be difficult to get a strap to fit it. It might have a very narrow lug width, or it might have an odd number lug width, which nowadays isn't too terrible, but it could. A lot of modern watches have weird irregular lug widths, 21 and 17 or something like that, odd numbered lug widths, and it might be hard to find a good strap. Or maybe you wanna get a vintage strap, and then you gotta hunt around because vintage strap, if it's a natural material, it could have rotted or dry rotted or been eaten by vermin or who knows what. Or just, gotten so old that it no longer maintains its structural integrity. So, those are all real questions to think about, if you're going to buy a vintage piece. But luckily, in most cases, unless it's something really obscure, you can find, uh, parts and you can find people to repair it and things of that nature because, th I didn't buy this display back for this, watch. Um, there are display backs available for watches of this nature, and if there are other accessories available for these vintage pieces out there. If you really want to hunt for it, it gives you an additional thing to add to the hobbyist hunting experience, as it were. Half of the joy of this collecting hobby is in the hunt, in the research, in the time spent making sure the money is well spent and the attention is well directed. Those are all important considerations. Um, Beyond the basic physical, there really aren't too many other serious considerations because, I mean, if you like a design, whether that design is vintage or retro or futuristic or postmodern, you're the one who's wearing it on your wrist, and you should be the one who enjoys the way it looks. Like I have a Ventura. It's in the shop. Speak of the devil, right? I have a Ventura currently in the shop, and it's a Ventura skeleton. And I know the one that Elvis made popular was the electric version, but I like the way the skeleton looks. And that's in the shop right now, and that's going to probably cost me a few hundred euros to get fixed. Um, and the Ventura is a Marmite watch. You love it or hate it, a Saab watch. Some people really like the Ventura design, and some people don't like the Ventura design. And I think it's an interesting suit watch. It makes it an eclectic statement. Elvis wore one famously when he was in the military. When he wore khakis or military dress, you can wear a watch, and he wore a Ventura to be distinctive, to show he was the king, I guess. Um, Chris, really like reissues of vintage watches, classic design with new technology, not as charming and more expensive. This is true. And often, because they're using modern technology, they're not really true to the old model. Like the Seiko reissued kind of a Pogue chrono. They issued a chrono that had the color scheme of the original Pogue, that gold and blue. And it's a nice looking piece. But the Pogue had a single totalizer, whereas the new Pogue has multiple totalizer dials, because the chronograph movements that they're using in them have multiple chrono dials, totalizer dials, and it wasn't worth the expense to re-engineer a single totalizer dial chrono. But the old Pogue was an interesting piece, you know. Or the Bulova Navigator that I just mentioned. I gave my son-in-law a vintage Navigator. They reissued the Navigator, and again, the original Navigator had the Lamania movement, center minutes, and the new Navigator has a three, totalizer chrono layout. So those are all beautiful renditions of the earlier model and true homages, but they are not the original piece, and they're not really, like, or think about the Bull of a Lunar Pilot. The Bull of a Lunar, the one that went to the moon was a mechanical piece. This is a high beat quartz. There's nothing wrong with that, but I wouldn't have minded seeing a lunar pilot with a mechanical chrono in it, hand wound even. Be more true to the original. What are your thoughts? Hey, Robert, how's it going? And Butters, I don't remember if I said hi, so say hi again. Um, my magazine's closing. Well, actually, it's closed. It closed the last week before last. But I get the issue dummy this week, so I'll be a little busy. But now that I'm back from Birmingham, I was at the ECCE Energy Conversion Conference, and some interesting stuff about grid stability. Um, and I didn't have a lot of time to do video editing, and I've still have some videos left over from the watch show that I went to with Chris near Darmstadt. So the next one I'll put up. I'll make sure I put up the Bomb Frog interview, because Bomb Frog's an interesting company. They make primarily divers, and the owner founder was a bomb frog man. He was a naval, not American naval, I believe UK naval. I forget what, I believe UK, but he was an underwater demolition diver, and now he makes watches that he likes, and some of the pieces are really nice. There is a short, one of the shorts up already shows one of the Bomb Frog pieces, but I have an interview that I'll edit this week and make sure that goes up this week for everybody to enjoy. Yeah, so Gian asks, how was the trip? I managed to do all kinds of Black Sabbath stuff because I did not know that there was also the World Tug of War Championships going on. But I didn't go see that, but that was going over at the University of Birmingham. But, yeah, uh, Black Sabbath and Ozzy Osbourne come from Birmingham, so there was a lot of memorabilia around, some murals, and there's a bridge with a big, memorial kind of thing where people put flowers when Ozzy died. And in the Birmingham Museum currently, there's a big exhibit on Ozzy Osbourne, which shows some of his Grammys and his trophies for being in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and pointed out that he sold some 70 plus million uh, songs or albums. I can't remember which, probably songs, but 70 million is a lot. Um, Not as much as some of the really, really big sellers like Sinatra, I think, is even in the top 10. But, I didn't sell that many songs of any kind. So, but it was nice to be in Birmingham and see all of that cool stuff. And Birmingham, I was very pleasantly surprised. I heard how oh, Birmingham's big and tough and the like, and they probably has some areas that I weren't that I was not able to visit, or luckily, I guess, that may have been rougher. But where I was near the convention center was near a club district. There were a lot of restaurants and pubs and clubs right there in that area with around one of the canals and near Victoria Square. I mean, so I guess because it was near the convention center and in a nice part of the city, it was a nice part of the city. Maybe there are other parts of Birmingham that aren't as nice, but where the places that was able to hang out in Birmingham uh, was quite nice. And we also had a side trip to the University of Nottingham. They have a power electronics lab there and doing a lot of stuff in motor drive, motors, doing some really high efficiency motors targeting things like aircraft and other applications that require incredibly high torque and power, but lightweight and small size, which is, of course, kind of a contraindication in motors because you want power. You're gonna no replacement for displacement, and that kind of goes with magnetics as well, because you want big magnets and you want big wires and the like for high powered motors. But they're finding ways using exotic winding techniques and materials and the like to, yeah, get there. It was a really interesting facility visit, and we had a nice lunch. Um, Not all the food is to my liking. I still think the British overcook their meat a lot. What they presented to me as a medium steak was actually more medium well, uh, emphasis on the towards well, but that's okay. The people are very fun, and it was a nice visit, and the beer, they love their beers up there. A lot of choice up there. German pubs, you might find 3, 4 beers. In even a small British pub, you're going to have 6, 8 beers to choose from, and they all have illuminated badges by the taps, which is nice. But yeah, the Birmingham trip was a nice trip. Eric, I do like the reissued Volcanes. They seem to be reproductions that are true to the original. Well, I think because they're reissued and they're not. If it was Volcane making homages to their earlier models, maybe it wouldn't have worked out like that. But since this is a company that's trying to bring Volcane back and they're reissuing Volcane, so they're not worried about trying to make an homage. They're trying to make that watch again, or as close to that watch as they can make. And I agree, the new Vulcanes are quite nice, quite nice. Although I always thought with them sending them, the presidents these watches, the presidents didn't ask for those watches. You look at what some of the presidents wore out of their personal choice. But the Vulcanes are nice pieces; they really are. And the new pieces are really nice, and I hope they continue to in their current success in the market. Um, Gian, yep, Black Sabbath and Judas Priest are two of the most legendary heavy metal bands from Birmingham. Well, there you go. Although I guess that supports some of the. I just thought there was maybe a fly up there. I guess that supports some of the history of roughness because those are some rough. I won't say rough bands as in physically rough, but you could tell that the cynicism and the anger and all and the poetry that came out came up from some tough streets. Gian, any vintage watch I want to still haven't given up on acquiring a vintage piece. If I could get like an old like Chris, he has a Speedmaster 2 Mark 2. I believe it was either the Mark 3 or the Mark 4 that had the Lamania based movement in it with central minutes. I wouldn't mind to get my hands on one of those, or even an old Lamania chrono that's in really good shape. An old because Lamania actually used to make watches as well. Um, or what else? Vintage. And that's one of the other negatives with vintages, is vintage watches aren't as well made as modern watches. I mean, unless you're talking like some of the very high-end handmade pieces, but if it's a mainstream vintage piece, the tolerances aren't as good as a modern piece because modern pieces are made with modern equipment, and modern equipment have better tolerances than that old stuff. Um, in most cases, it doesn't matter, but in the case of some watches, like if you think about a vintage date just is a better suit watch than it is an everyday wear. The case isn't as heavy duty as a modern date just, for example. Not that you couldn't wear one as a daily wear, you just have to be a little bit careful. Don't bang it into anything. You wouldn't want to bang in a modern date just into anything either. But odds are the modern date just to leave a ding in the wall. Um, but yeah, that's one of the things to think about with a vintage as well. Like I had an Omega, alarm, Memomatic, and you couldn't wind it backwards. Either the pawl had broke, I had taken it in to get it serviced, and I got it back, and I still couldn't. It didn't really want to wind backwards. It didn't ratchet or anything, so I always had to wind it forwards without any back play. And the alarm didn't always work as well as because it's an old piece. The fact that it ran at all and told good time was an achievement on the watchmaker's part in restoring it. But a new Memo Vox would run way better, cost a lot more. Again, vintage, inexpensive way to get the nice complications. But yeah, those old watches are not going to be as robust or as, I mean, like that pocket watch I have to take in again and spend another couple €100 to have the watchmaker, you know, resuscitate it. But that's another aspect of a vintage. If you have a vintage and you use it, wear it, wind it, it's going to need more servicing eventually. If you have it serviced and you just leave it in a velvet box, it'll last longer. But what fun is that? Gian, speaking of vintage watches, is it true that, like some of our friends in the chat say, that vintage original Longines is better than the Swatch Group Longines? Yes, yes. Vintage Longines, that's how they got their reputation. I mean, they didn't become Longines by, having issues with their products. Some of the vintage Longines stuff is very collectible. A lot of older companies pre-Swatch integration, some of their pieces are quite collectible and worth it. Hagfish, hey, hey. What's my oldest piece so far in my collection? How many vintage do I have? Well, if pocket watches count, this is 1899. This quarter repeater, 1899. That's the oldest watch in my collection. It's a pocket watch, though. The oldest physical watch in my collection, it's probably a tie. It's probably a tie between my Accutron and my Walkman, because I believe the Accutron, this version of the Space View, I believe, came out in the 70s, and this Walkman also came out in the 70s. So these two pieces are my oldest watches in my collection. And they each have their own charm, because the Walkman, as I said earlier in the show, it's a flyback, and it's an old school flyback in that you have to zero. Let's push the button. You have to zero the totalizers before you run the stopwatch. See, so if you notice, the totalizers at 6 and 9 are now zeroed, and it's a flyback in all other sense. You hit the reset button and it pops back. Um, the Accutron is interesting in the fact that it's just a historical piece of horology. The Accutron tuning fork mechanism dominated the market for over a decade before quartz became available. In fact, the original Accutron, I mean, they didn't change the movement at all. So I should say the Accutron movement was invented in the late 50s, and it was actually restricted to, it was one of those commercial restrictions. The Vanguard satellite had an Accutron in it in 1957, and the first Accutron watch didn't hit the streets till 1960. And then the Seiko Astron hit the streets on in '69. So for that decade and the slight period after, the Accutron dominated the watch industry as the most accurate piece that was available at the time. So that's why I like having my little Accutron. Um, Hagfish, wow, don't even what those are. Do they still run? Yeah, well, the Accutron still runs, the Walkman still runs, the repeater still runs. What happened was, it fell on the carpet, and now the bezel's loose, so I'm, gonna take it in. I don't wanna try to fix it myself, but it see, so it rings for the and it rang true, quarter hours, 2 quarter hours, and, 9 hours. So it's 1890s, and it's still functional. The Accutron, as you saw, the hand was sweeping, and just to show you the flyback on this, I'll wind the Walkman up for you all also. Okay, wind the Walkman back up for you. See, so there it's running, and hit the flyback. See, so it's a true flyback. It just has it just has an extra button to, 0 the hour and minute totalizers before, because they just run with the movement. They just run with the movement, when not in use. So, but fully functional. This was new old stock. That's why the bezel is in such good shape, because this bezel, if it, had been worn for a long period of time by anyone, it would have been beat to heck. And I don't wear it that often. I just like having it in the collection. Um, but I do wear it occasionally, and it's a really nice piece. And so this and the Accutron are probably the oldest. Oh, no, I take that back. The Ambassador, because this one I believe is from the 50s or 60s, probably 60s, but this is older than the 70s. And it's got that, for those of you who came in late, well, I'll give you another look see. It's got the Buren micro rotor movement in it, which is just a gorgeous, gorgeous movement. And that's one of the kind of things that you can get from a vintage is you get yourself a piece that has some serious history, still looks this Bulova Ambassador, and this is an old American Bulova. This is pre-Casio, I mean, a pre-Citizen Bulova, obviously, and a perfect example of a vintage piece from a legacy company that represents the true history of the product. And this is a really nice piece. But I'm probably going to give it to my son-in-law because I don't, I have too many dress watches anyway, and I just picked up. Some of you may know, I, Chris was with me when I picked this up. I just got my hands on this gorgeous Globemaster annual calendar, and it's a great suit watch. In fact, I wore it when I had I just had some portraits made for the magazine, because I wanted to get a new picture in there as the from the editor page picture. And so I had to finally bit the bullet and had some professionals do it. And I wore that watch, and it looked really good in the pictures. I'll post a picture of in my feed so you can at least see I actually look almost responsible in it. Good photographer. So, what brand is that black and red watch? I believe you were talking about this one. Yes, this is a Walkman. The company Walkman no longer exists. Some people consider Walkman the predecessor to Breitling because Walkman was bought by the company that eventually became Breitling. And as I'd mentioned earlier, I think you can see a little bit of Breitling DNA in the old Walkman design. But this is an old, beautiful, vintage, functional. So if you're actually interested in it, I'll sell it to you. Make me a good offer, and Let's see what happens. Email me at smartalix, ALIX at yahoo.com. And also, if you have a collection or if you have a watch that you want me to look at, any of you, I always like to help people out in valuation or uh, finding some history about a piece. Just let me know. So, hagfish. Does every oh 1 second. The bullet is a quartz. No, well, you just saw the movement. It's a micro rotor. See, that's not a battery in there. That's a micro rotor. Okay, this is a micro rotor movement. So I do have a bull of a quartz, my um, lunar pilot, but no, this is completely manual. And that micro rotor movement is one of the things I was saying about a vintage. Able to get interesting movements and interesting complications that you wouldn't be able to afford in a modern watch. Um, does every watch, Hagfish asks, does every watch in my collection still run? How do I maintain my vintage watches? I take them to the watchmaker when they break, and I pay. I I I close my eyes and I dream of nice things as I hand over my hard-earned money to the watchmaker to maintain the pieces. But you have to maintain the pieces. If they break, they're not worth much, are they? You know. Did the bells come from the watch? Yes, that's a repeater. It rings the hours. In the old-timey days, a quarter repeater was usually used by a, working man, like a police sergeant or someone who needed to know what time it was at night, and they didn't have luminescent paint in the 1890s, and they didn't have, much in the way of street lamps at 1 in the morning anywhere. So to have a watch that rang the hours allowed you to know what time it was without having to see the face. And rich people had minute repeaters, and they used to piss off the king by checking the time during the play or the opera, and you'd hear an old ting tong ting from the balcony all the time. But yeah, those bells came from the watch. Isn't it beautiful? Um, what brand is? I read that already. Oscar, I have an Accutron M8 with Swiss movement tuning fork. I want a service. I like the watch. Well, look around in your neighborhood. If you don't find anybody, just Google the Accutron Doctor Japan, and that's who did my Speed Sonic, and he's still in business. I don't know if I still have his information, but like I said, you can just Google him, Accutron Doctor, and you can even say Alex told sent you. Not that you'll get anything for it, but he'll be happy that his customer remembered him. Um, that is a beautiful movement. I agree, Hagfish. Oscar used to show that to the lads. Um, Hagfish is still a chronograph despite its movement. I don't. I think you mean the Walkman. Yes, it's a chronograph, but it's a flyback. That's all. It allows you to do things like rapidly time multiple events, things of that nature. Um, the other bull of the square watch. You mean the Accutron? Yeah, no, this is a tuning fork. What you see the 2, copper coils at the top, those cups they're sitting in are the heads of a tuning fork, and if your eye even follow it down, from 12 o'clock down to 6 o'clock, it's a U-shaped metal tuning fork in there, and it's an electronic watch, but it's not a quartz watch. In fact, that's why the government was so hot for it, because you could run this watch in a dashboard of an aircraft from the battery of the aircraft, not have to worry about winding it. Because heck, I have a MiG-21 dash clock that you had to wind. Yeah, imagine, Gian, I imagine how we take alarm clocks for granted now. Hey, Archie, hey. If I have some time this evening, would love to chat some watches with me. You know what? I'll do it next week. I promise. I can't do it today because I got my issue closed this week. I mean, my getting my issue dummy this week, and I have a bunch of stuff to get ready for the magazine. So I got to get up early tomorrow. So I unfortunately can't do it tonight. But I've done it before, and I enjoyed being on your show. So I'll definitely let's make a plan for next Sunday. I'll be more than happy to do it next Sunday, or even during the week if you have one. If I see you're up, I'll keep my eyes open. put a notice up, and I'll drop in on you unexpectedly. Hagfish, I saw I have a Breitling Navitimer. Yes, I really do like it, and I have had it, well, not serviced. I've keep an eye on it. I put it in the time grapher. I have replaced the strap, and I've done some cosmetic stuff. But no, I so far so good. I haven't had any issues with this piece, and it runs well. And I keep an eye on it. And if I do have to have it serviced, I am going to take it in. But I really do like my Navitimer. It's one of the pieces that I put in my probably not sell unless desperate for money list. I've got a couple of pieces like that. Like for example, I'd sell the Nomos if somebody really wanted to get their hands on the Nomos. I'd probably sell the Nomos. My IWC is currently in the window of a local shop on a commission sale. Um, Maybe the Longines. But I really do like this Longines, so I probably wouldn't sell it, but if I would sell this before I sold my, Omega or my, Nicolas Roussec, my Mont Blanc, you know, you do have watches you could be prepared to get rid of and watches that you would only get rid of if you unless you were desperate for the cash. Luckily, I don't have to worry about that at this stage. But there are some pieces I would just casually sell compared to ones that I would keep, and that Navitimer is definitely on the keep list. Oh, Oscar, just very difficult time to spend extra money, but this is true. Uh, oh, looks like a quartz. Well, yeah, because it's got electronic stuff in it. I understand. Uh, Best of luck with the issue. Anytime, I'm always welcome. Thank you. I really appreciate that invite. I really do. It touches. I'm touched because you're one of the elder statesmen of the industry, the Pope of watches, and it's always an honor to be on the show with you. And that reminds me, I am going to end punctually because, like I said, I got promise it to keep in miles to go before I sleep, as it were. Um, Gian, I didn't get what Accutron was. Well, that the Accutron is the brand name, and it's a description of the movement. Um, I would love the Navitimer in black. Agfish, I'm very partial to blue. I mean, I like the occasional black piece, but I'm very partial to blue. That's why I really like my Frederic Constant World Timer. It's nice and blue. I have some very nice blue pieces, like my Jaeger-LeCoultre Polaris Chrono that I recently picked up. I love that blue. I love a blue face. But I know people who love black face watches as well. Nothing wrong with that. Or white face. I have some of all of those different colors. Um, but yeah, I do like my Navitimer in blue. Nomos is one of the fine German watches. I just found out they don't have the heritage as they only exist in the 80s, right? Well, no, Nomos themselves as a brand, yes, but they come from the Glashütte Watch Consortium, the movements from Deutsche Uhrenwerk. They are, that's why they say Glashütte underneath the word Nomos. They're part of the Glashütte watchmaking consortium out there. And so it's not so much that Nomos has a legacy that goes back pre-World War II. The movement, the watchmaking behind that watch does go back that far. The Deutsche Uhrenwerk, the movement maker, is part of that old legacy. So Nomos is a relatively new brand based on legacy watchmaking, kind of, I guess, like a nice Swatch group. Bad joke. Um, Chris, good night. Good night. Glashütte is part of Swatch, right? Um, Maybe the brand of Glashütte Original, or I'm not sure. I'd have to look that up. But there are like 16 or 18 watch companies in Glashütte. So some of them might be involved with the Swatch Group, but definitely not all. On that note, thank you so much for watching. Love you all. Have a fantastic week. And most importantly, have a great evening. Take care, everybody. Until next week. And like I said, keep an eye out for that bomb frog. I'll try to get it out. If not tomorrow, then Tuesday. That's another thing I have to do during the week. Take care, everybody. Bye bye.